Hello, Bev. Welcome to the Mentally a Badass podcast. I'm so happy to have you today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you and your audience.
Me too. And like I said before I clicked record here, I'm very excited to talk about attachment theory. Even though, as you said before, it's not necessarily new. This is a topic that not many people know about. It's not common knowledge. So I'm sure people are not going to really know what it's about. But before we get into that, in every Mentally About Us episode, we like to dig deep into your past. We like to go there.
Right.
Alrighty. So you've had a chaotic childhood experience, correct?
I have.
So, me too. Twinsies.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get into that. Let's talk a little bit about your childhood. Where would you like to start?
First of all, I love the name of your podcast, Mentally a Badass. Like, it's just empowering. So well
Thank
done on that
you.
front. Childhood, as we're going to talk about in terms of attachment theory, it has such an incredible impact on the lens,
Hmm.
on how we view things, our emotional patterns, our thought patterns. And it's just so interesting because when you're in the middle of going through, the chaos or you're growing up, you don't even realize how dysregulated things are because that is your baseline. So
Hmm.
many of my clients will tell me they didn't realize that their childhood was so dysfunctional until years later when they were able to take space from their family of origin and look back and go, what do you mean? That's not normal? Not everyone experienced that. And so I had a similar epiphany years after I left my family of origin and I got married and I started my own family, that I started looking back and going, wow, that really wasn't normal. And I always knew, and children always know, that it doesn't feel good. There's something that doesn't feel good. And so, I would say that the household that I grew up in was lacking a stable or secure frame. Right. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking emotionally. So I'm very grateful for the fact that I had two parents. I had 3 meals a day. I had everything I needed from a physical standpoint, but emotionally, both my parents were emotionally unavailable in very different ways. And so I spent a good chunk of my childhood and then my later years, I would say, um, you know, trying to convince someone, a difficult person, to be kind to me. So that, like, we'll take a moment to reflect on that because a lot of childhood trauma is rooted in this idea that if I'm just a little bit nicer, if I'm better or whatnot, that difficult person that I'm interfacing with, usually a parent, they'll be kinder to me.
Which is so not true.
It's so not true, but children don't understand
Of
that.
course, yeah.
Yeah, we all think that it has, if I was more likable, if I was more compliant, if I was easier, if I was prettier, if I was smarter, they would love me, right? So we really do need that consistent love, and that forms this environment of safety and security for a child to know that they are loved for who they are. And so I didn't necessarily have that. I do believe my parents loved me, but not in the way that was healthy. My behavior was heavily controlled, with emotional abuse. And so my parents, one or both, would yell often. They would not, they would take away their love, right? They would ignore me. Like they would, ice me out. I was heavily punished over and over and over. And so there was no space for me to be
Okay.
just who I was,
Yeah.
and just like, there were certain things that was not tolerated in my family. Like, little girls were not supposed to be angry. And so I was taught very young, just sit in the corner and look cute. That's your job. Right.
Hmm.
And so all these messages came to me very, very early on. And for me, it was very damaging.
Yeah, and absolutely. I've been through something similar where I grew up in a household where I was constantly being yelled at. So I've had, my two parents and my sister. Two were unemotionally unavailable. And then the other one was very emotional and then emotionally unavailable at certain times. It's kind of like you didn't know what was gonna happen. You know what I mean? Like it just depends what day it is, how she feels that day. So like I grew up in a chaotic household, so that's why I'm like I feel like we can relate and really like have this conversation. One question I do have for you that I kind of want to go back a little bit is can you give me an example of something that you thought was normal as a child, but then you found that that actually wasn't normal?
There's so many examples actually. Like I was very, very afraid of my father, and I kind of thought, well, isn't everyone afraid of their father? Like,
Oh,
right? Like, isn't that just sort of normal?
yeah.
I became also hyper attuned. I mean, I was living on edge all the time, right? Yeah, so I remember growing up being really afraid of my father.
Hmm.
And so, at some point I kind of asked myself, well, isn't everyone afraid of their father? Like to me, that was sort of normal. My father would come home from work and my mother would manufacture stories of things that happened during the day. Maybe I said something or I did something or I didn't. She would make things up. And
Hmm.
she really wanted the attention of my father. And so she would make things up. And then my father would be so aggravated and he would either be emotionally abusive, psychologically abusive, at times physically abusive, right? So um, I just remember spending a good part of my childhood alone. I used to barricade myself in my room and like put a piece of furniture in front of the door because I was petrified.
Yeah.
And I thought about this like, well, I just assumed that everyone was living the same life, right?
Yeah.
And then there was a bathroom in our house. It was the only place in the house that had a lock, right? My bedroom didn't have a lock. So when I discovered the lock, I ended up spending hours and hours and hours in the bathroom because it became my safe space because nobody could get to me. And so I would sit there, and this was before cell phones, right? So I would sit
Yeah.
for hours and hours and hours in the bathroom, just sort of like shaking and
Aw.
just hoping that no one could get to me. And when it sounded like the house was quiet, I would like sneak back into my bedroom. But the interesting thing is that years and years later, once I was well out of that home and I was married to a wonderful man who was never a day in his life mean to me, but I held on to the same behavior, which meant every time I felt overwhelmed or scared or fearful, I would run to the bathroom and I would barricade myself in the bathroom. And I didn't even realize I was doing this. And I
Yeah.
remember my husband once said to me, like, are you okay? Like, do you have a stomach ache? And I was like, no. And he's like, well, what are you doing in the bathroom for hours? And I was like,
That
I'm
followed you.
yeah, and I had to think about it. I go, I don't know. I just feel safe. But it took me a while to pin it back together why I was doing this, right? So the threat
Yeah.
is no longer present, but the behavior can like, it lasted well into adulthood. So that's a small example, but
It's a good
what
one.
we, yeah, what we learn in childhood really does follow us.
Yeah, no, that's a really good one, and I feel like that's kind of like a conditioning thing. It's like, oh, one thing happens, so then that happens, then you do this, and it's something you're when you're a child, your brain is developing. It's a sponge, so that's what it learns, and then you're subconsciously doing that, right? Like if something were to happen, if there's any yelling, you just like, okay, yeah, I gotta go hide, right? Like for me, that's like your fight or like it's like your different like fight or flight responses and such. Like for me, I freeze.
Mhm.
Like I notice that. I notice if there's like anything like someone yelling at me, I just kind of sit there
Huh?
and I like dissociate.
Yes.
That's literally what I do. Can I think back like times I've been like outside of childhood, like I'm away from that, right? I've been yelled at by like really like jerks, like of course throughout life and such. And yeah, I remember this one time this like roommate that I had who was interesting, she was like screaming at me and it came out of nowhere. And I just like was like, that was me like the whole time. I was like, and then she walks out and I'm just like, and at one point I thought I was just like, oh wow, I'm really good at not caring. But I mean I did obviously in the
Yeah.
back of my brain. I just dissociated. My brain was
Do
like
you
protecting me.
remember? Well, so you have a beautiful understanding here, right? So your
Hmm.
subconscious mind, as you talked about, its job is to, just
Protect
make
you.
sure you survive.
Right.
So it brings you towards what's familiar. So in terms of your coping mechanism, so if that's worked for you in the past, then it makes sense that you're going to keep repeating it over and over. And what's so interesting, Justine, that you bring up is that we see this in nature quite a bit.
Mhm.
When like human behavior is fascinating, but like
It is.
it is when an animal perceives a threat or is under attack, like some animals will play dead, which is a freeze response, like, right? And because they're just sort of holding their breath and waiting for the threat to pass. And
Mhm.
so that's what you're doing in this moment. But I wonder if do you remember what you were thinking, what your thought pattern was as you're being yelled at?
That's a really good question. I do remember what happened after.
Okay.
So actually what happened was I was that apartment itself was already pretty chaotic in its own way, and I was living with like, well, as at this moment, ex-boyfriend. And I just had to go back to my apartment to get my car because it was parked there. 'Cause I had to go and get an MRI done with my neck. I'm like having neck problems, and so one of the things that this girl said to me, saying she basically was like saying, "Oh, no one likes you. Everyone thinks you're crazy. Like you need to get your brain checked because you're like psycho or something." It was something in that way. And the thing that stuck with me is saying I need to get my brain checked. So when that happened, I walked out to the car and I was like, should I ask the doctor to scan my brain instead? Like that was what I thought. So, but now, obviously it's not a good way of thinking. Like I'm not crazy. That girl was just clearly having her own demons that she's dealing with. At that time, I was stronger then than when I was a child. Of course, because especially since I was in college for psychology, so I know a little bit about human behavior. I was like a junior then, so I knew that it wasn't me. But at the end of the day, it's still like the little girl inside me that's hurt. And another thing I do want to say is when I used to work for Disney, and so I've met people from all over the world, and some people are just not the nicest people, right? And I've been yelled at like multiple times. And I think another thing too is like I guess my freezing kind of worked there because you can't really like bark back at them. So I kind of just like sat there, and then like I my last job with them, it was a call center job. So I would just literally just be like having headphones on, just casually just sitting there being yelled at. And there was a couple, like a lot of times it's like I just go through it because it's just a job. But then there's sometimes people would scream so loud and they'll go on and on. And then sometimes the people would actually say like things like, "Oh, I'm just like stupid," or like there's certain things that they say they're gonna like people are like the customer is always gonna like be jerks. Don't take it personal, right? That's what they're always gonna say. But the thing is that I don't like about that advice is that at the end of the day, I'm a human being, and especially since I have history of trauma of being yelled at and affecting me, it's gonna be harder for me, right? And I actually with the constant being yelled at, I had to call after call after call, while other jobs I've had at least had some breaks. It actually triggered me a lot where I went into a deep depression where I was like calling in once a week. I had to go on FMLA, and I do have a diagnosis of bipolar. And as you know, bipolar, if you're under a lot of stress, it flares. And so I was getting like all the symptoms, all my coping mechanisms just flew out the window.
Yeah.
It's like everything I've learned up until then, it was hard for me to cope. So what I did was I in a way froze and I stayed home yeah, I avoided it. And so I had to go to FMLA, otherwise I would have been easily fired for not showing up to work. And there was times where I had to like leave work if I had like a really bad call because I would get triggered and it would be hard for me to go back to like just snap out of it. Cause you obviously you just can't snap out of things. Like I would freeze during the call. And then sometimes I'll just like get through it. Okay, yeah, whatever. Have that feeling. And then sometimes I just go to the bathroom and cry. So it depends, of course, what they say. But yeah, I mean, if you think about it, like for someone like for me who has a history of that childhood trauma, that job probably wasn't the best job for me.
Yeah, I would say, Justine, that you seem to have a really good understanding of your own mind and your emotional patterns. And I think you're right that that was not the right environment for you, right? But I think also the other thing that you learned from this experience is that, when a random person is yelling at you and you're getting triggered to that extent, you know yourself that it's triggering something that's unresolved. within
Yeah.
you, right? So it's touching on a wound that you have there. It's not because this random person, because that person means nothing to you, right? So they can't affect you in that way, right? The people that we really love, those are the people that we, that matter what they say.
Hmm.
And so what it's doing is that it's bringing forth a very strong emotional response for every time you didn't stick up for yourself, for every time that you felt small and allowed yourself to feel that way, right? And so
Hmm.
but it's not a healthy environment for anyone, especially
Yeah.
someone who has this in their past. But I don't want you to feel alone, like I can tell you that to this day when my phone rings,
Hmm.
I get a little like, because but I can talk myself down now, right? So I understand. And because I used to be called so often by this person, that person, mostly family, and just berated, yelled at, or this. And
Yeah.
so now even when the phone rings and it's not a family member and it's a friend who's never yelled at me a day in their life, sometimes I pick up on the phone and I go, "What's wrong? Are you upset?" Because my pattern is saying you're calling to,
Yeah. Like yell or
give me
something.
shit or yell or
Yeah.
yeah. So we have to learn these patterns in ourselves.
Yeah, I still do that too. Like right now what I do for work is I'm a social media manager and I have clients, right? And every time
Excuse you, Justine.
what's so funny is that the
Oh my
last
God, I need help.
what's so funny is that the last person I interviewed today said the exact same thing.
Telling you, Justine, this social media stuff, like, I mean, I'm a therapist and I do all my own social media. I try, but it's really hard to keep up.
Oh, tell me about it. So I'm a social media manager, so I have clients, right? And so they're all nice to me. Like none of them has ever yelled at me. They're all respectful. The ones that I have now, I've had my fair share of not respectful ones over the couple of years I've been doing this. But the ones that I have, they're long term. They're always nice to me. But every time I get a text message and I see it from them, my stomach drops. I hate it. And it's like, I know that they're not going to yell at me. There's no reason that I should think that because there's no history of them yelling at me or treating me poorly. But
Right.
every time I get that text message, it just subconsciously, it just does it by itself. I'm like, what do I do so I physically don't have my stomach drop? Like it hurts after, the kind of anxiety I'm talking about. It can hurt physically.
Yes, it
So
can.
actually, you have an answer to that? How can I get rid of that?
I do. So you really do have power over your own mind, right? So
Mhm.
the more that you can make the connections between my anxiety appears in this way, because for everyone it feels a little different. I get dizzy, sometimes I get a headache, I get a pit in my stomach. Sometimes actually I feel a little flutter in my eyelid. No one can see it, but I can feel it.
So
Yeah,
wait, I didn't know that was psychological. Okay.
it is.
Now I
It's so
know.
it's either an indication of stress and anxiety or when you're overtired. So it could be both. But so the more you can connect to the physicality of your different emotions and how they present, then you can become friends with them. So when my eyelid starts to flutter, I go, I know who you are. Okay, okay, old friend, I know who you are. Everything's fine.
Yeah.
Right. So I can talk myself down. And the first thing I ask myself when the the phone rings and I get the feeling, I actually can say to myself, I'm not going to be yelled at. That's just an old friend reminding me of what I used to go through.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like it's sort of like I'm no longer in that situation. I actually can feel a moment of gratefulness,
Mhm.
gratitude. I'm no
Mhm.
longer there. I can pick up this call, and in the off chance that I am, let's say, yelled at, because it's very
Mhm.
rare these days,
Mhm.
I know how to handle it. I trust that I will handle it.
Yeah, right. Another thing I kind of do too is that I think like, okay, let's say if they yell at me. Okay, they yell at me. What's the worst that can happen? I guess I just kind of also think that like if I ever get nervous or scared of just anything, I'm just like I kind of, I guess, in a way, mentally prepare myself just so I don't have any reason. I can just kind of just lower my anxiety. Because at the end of the day, and I actually like did a solo episode on this, is like we are here to enjoy life, to have amazing experiences. But yet, a lot of people spend their time in life taking it like so seriously to the point where they're like killing themselves.
Yeah, so there's reasons why they do that too, and I want to go into attachment
Yeah.
too, right? So I just want to talk about the reason why this is so impactful for us is because as children, when our caregivers are unloving, right? So they're yelling, they're punishing, they're pulling away their love, they're ignoring us, they're neglecting us. It is it feels like it's an absolute threat to our survival and our existence. And that is true for a very short amount of time when we
Mhm.
are very, very young. Without the love and care and nurturing of a caretaker, we as humans, we don't survive. We are so dependent as a species from 0 to 5. And
Yeah.
so those patterns are there for a reason, right? So, this is why attachment styles is so incredibly important. But so what happens is I want to talk really briefly about this. Is that okay that we go into attachment styles?
Oh yeah, I was gonna ask you anyway, so you kind of beat me to it.
Okay, great. So, depending on the type of environment that you grew up in, you will either develop what's called a secure attachment or an insecure attachment. And that's an attachment style vis-a-vis your caregiver. So, if you grew up in a home where your caregiver was consistent with you, nurturing, they gave you space to feel your feelings. They taught you about emotions. They taught you about emotional regulation. They were respectful with you. And that doesn't mean that they gave you everything you wanted when you wanted it, right?
Mhm.
Because children will push the boundaries. But what it means is that they were consistent in how they interacted with you. So
Mhm.
that helped develop the level of safety and predictability that you had in someone else's behavior. It also gave you a green light to be able to say, okay, I don't always have to be this perfect smiley person. If I'm feeling sad, I can say to my mother, for example, I'm feeling sad because I really wanted a cookie before dinner.
Mhm.
And she's going to respond to me. She might not give me the cookie, but she'll respond to me nonetheless in a kind way. And so what that brings together as a child and then further into adulthood is this child who's got a very good sense of self, right? They've learned the underpinnings of emotional regulation, their own body, and they've also learned that it is safe to be my authentic self and to communicate to others that they will respond to me in a healthy, kind way most of the time.
Yeah.
No one's perfect,
Yeah. I actually
right?
have a big question for you.
Please.
Okay. So it came to mind, and I've always wondered about this, like in my childhood, because my attachment style with my boyfriend, it's kind of like opposite in a way. My dad, majority of the time he was okay. Let me just start out if he's a good guy. Let's start out there because he is. But sometimes he'll be like neglecting, as in like he's not interested, he doesn't listen. I know he doesn't like mean to be like that, but it's like I'm not interested to him. But then sometimes he would just be kind of annoying. He'd be like, "Oh, like give me a kiss," and like hugging me and like forcing me to hug him. So it's like, and I hated it as a child. And still today, he tries to like just mess around. I'm like, nah. You know what I mean? Like, so he would always do that. And then everyone would just say, like, oh, it's just a joke. Like, it's funny. Like, whatever. But it's like I've always hated it. And
Mhm.
when I said I always hated it, people just don't get it. It's like I don't like being like constantly forced to hug someone or like being like oh and they don't mean for it to be a bad thing. I just don't think they really understood a boundary there that I had as a child. And still today, like I hate like it still annoys me. So I guess like I mean I guess what you're saying is is inconsistent. So I guess what is that kind of I guess creating for me? Because one thing I actually with my boyfriend is he's also like a very lovey guy, but he is consistent with it. But he is a lovey guy, and his what is that called? Love language is physical. So when his love language is physical, he's like obviously wants to be all lovey dovey, and I just like don't touch me. I mean, sometimes I am lovey back, but like there are times where I'm just like, don't touch me. So like, do you think that kind of I guess routes back to that?
Yes. And it might be other things as well. But at some point in time, we see this very often. We see where we feel compelled as children to this forced affection.
That's what it is. Yeah.
And so it's disingenuous and it's not authentic. It doesn't feel good. And we see this in situations where children are, you know, for example, I mean, this happened to me as a child. I would get slapped in the face, and then, it's like, okay, it's over now. Give me a hug. It's not over for me,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, yeah. I've had
Yeah.
those moments too with other
Yeah.
people as
Or,
a child.
yeah. And so, or like everywhere I went, I used to have like a really chubby face, and like people would pinch my cheeks and this. I didn't like to be touched. And
Hmm.
a child who can't say I don't like to be touched, again, they're not they're they're not being given the autonomy to say, listen, this is what I'm comfortable with. And so these people often have a hard time when they grow up with boundaries, right? Because it's like, well, I didn't like to be touched. I didn't. So oftentimes what happens is that, the sentiment of being forced to do something actually just feels much bigger than it is, right?
Hmm.
So it's very common to feel uncomfortable with a certain level of touch, especially when it's forced. And I'm not even talking about sexual touch, just holding someone's hands or playing with my hair or something like that. So, yes, it probably has something to do with that.
Yeah.
And I would say that what I picked up on is you were very, very careful to almost apologize for your father's behavior. 2 or 3 times you told me he's a good person. No, he's a good guy. So there's a part of you that's trying to protect him or is afraid of upsetting him should he ever see this video. There's something that you're doing to sort of again try to
Yeah.
please him.
Well, I think it's because besides, outside of that, he's done a lot for me as a father, where most fathers, not most, I don't know about most, but like a lot of fathers wouldn't do for their kids. Like, even though I'm an adult, I'm 29 years old. And let's say if I'm like in trouble for anything, like if I'm have some type of medical problem, which has happened and such, like he's a good father when it comes to that. And he always puts his kids first. So it's just with my father, he loves us, he just doesn't know how to show it properly. He kind of shows it as in like actions, as like he would give you like your, what does I say, like the sweater or shirt off your back, or
Get off your back. Yeah.
he's that kind of guy.
So,
So
you know
yeah.
how you talked about love language and your boyfriend, his love language is touch? It's very
Yeah.
possible that your father's love language is acts of service.
Oh, it is. Mine is
Right,
too. I'm the
right,
same way.
right. And so, he shows his love in different ways. And I always say that as parents, I believe that most of us do the best that we can with what we have at the time. I also have 2 adult children. They're 18 and 20. They're away at university. I did not get everything right. I know I didn't. So we do the best that we can. And it sounds like your father really tried. So kudos to him. I'm not in any way blaming or shaming, but it does sound like emotionally he was incapable of connecting to you in a way that
Hmm.
you really desired.
Yes.
Right? That he was emotionally unavailable, that there was some emotional neglect. And that doesn't mean it's purposeful, but emotional neglect, not engaging, not interacting, not being interested, disassociating. So you could understand that the first thing you told me about you is that when you're under stress, you disassociate. But
Hmm.
isn't that exactly what your father does?
Yeah, actually, I saw him recently get anxious when because my parents, they fight like all the time and they kind of put me in the middle of it as an adult. But there was times where I was pretty much like their like therapist and trying to like fix their problems, which I know is I shouldn't be responsible for that. But I guess part of me felt like I owe them back because like they're not, here I go again. They're not bad parents. It's just no one, no one's perfect. They have their own thing. At least my mom's admitted it, and my dad kind of depends on the day, but he's starting to be a little bit more about mental health now, but before he wasn't. So we're talking about something, I think we went back to his like childhood about something, and his body language was like he was kind of like tapping or his foot and like looking the other way. Like his body language basically told me that he does not want to have this conversation. Like it was very obvious, and then he just didn't like talking deep. like that. He didn't like going back there. And it kind of makes me wonder, like I already know what happened in my mom's childhood. She's very open about her mental health and what happened to her as a child, which was worse than mine. But my dad doesn't talk about his. The only thing I know from his childhood is that my abuelo used to hit my abuela. Like, so there was some beating there that my dad saw. He's never been beaten from, at least I don't think he has from my, I don't know. But he doesn't go too in detail. He doesn't really just talk, he doesn't talk about it. He's more of like a, like why bother talking? Let's just move forward in this. Like he's that kind of, and that's because he doesn't really understand mental health.
And I don't think he's ever learned how to process emotions, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, this is like we haven't done men any favors, by saying that, you have to be stoic and sweep everything under the rug. And because really what we've given men, like for the most part, we've given, like society has given them sort of the green light to show a very few emotions like anger and pride, but there's so many more in between, right? That
Yep.
we don't really give license to men to be able to express and feel. And so this is a very common scenario. And so it seems like he was exceptionally good at compartmentalizing and dismissing or ignoring his own emotions. So you could imagine, if you look at it from that lens, how would he ever have the capability to, interact and understand your emotions? He's busy ignoring his own. He's
Yeah.
grieving for yours, right? And he likely ignored your mother's as well.
Yeah, that's a whole other, that's
Follow
very,
up.
that's like a whole other episode, whole other podcast.
Right. But you see, the behavior stems from him, right? So the more connected you are to yourself, the less strained the relationships you have with those around you, right? Because you can understand other people's perspectives. I want to just kind of, broaden out what we were talking about a little bit further. We talked about the secure attachment. There's also the insecure attachment.
Mhm.
And that is really a large category of people, at least 50 to 60% of our population in North America, who grow up in a home whereby they did not get the consistent emotional attunement from their caregivers. And so it's some of the stuff that we talked about, right? Either their parents were emotionally unavailable, or they were abandoned, or they perceived that they were abandoned, the child perceives that they were abandoned or emotionally neglected, or maybe the child was put in the middle of a highly contentious divorce. There was a lot of fighting going on. There was a lot of chaos. There was violence. There was abuse. Maybe there was alcoholism. I could go on and on and on,
Mhm.
right? In which children grow up in these environments where their caregivers are not emotionally attuned. And this really does, it creates a different lens for that child, where the child doesn't feel safe in the world to make other connections. The child learns that I just have to do what I have to do to survive. And
Yeah.
the techniques that they develop to survive really depends on where they fall in the continuum, the scale of insecure attachment. Because on one side, we have those that are anxiously attached, also in the literature called anxious preoccupied.
Mhm.
And then on the other side of the insecure attachment, we have those who are avoidantly attached, dismissive avoidant. And then we have a small subset of people who are what's called disorganized attached, where they have some traits of anxious and some traits of avoidant, and they sit right in the middle. And they're also called fearful avoidance. And so why does all this matter? Because there's some very, very highly predictive patterns around how these people will interact as adults vis-a-vis themselves and everyone else around them, based on what they initially felt, heard, seen, and experienced in childhood. So someone who's anxious, preoccupied is someone who's generally falls into a category of a people pleaser. They often carry core wounds like I'm unlikable, I'm not good enough, I will be excluded. So their focus is outward. So they're craving the attention, validation, reassurance from external sources so deeply, because they've got such a sense a low sense of self-worth, right? So these are the people in relationships that we often, I don't like this word, but people will call them needy, clingy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, because the idea of their partner leaving them is so threatening to them. But because these people really never learned how to self-soothe. They are codependent, they are relationally dependent on other people to be able to regulate their nervous system. We see a high degree of emotional volatility in everyone who has an insecure attachment, but especially those who are anxiously attached. If someone starts to pull away, they tend to chase,
Mhm.
right? So we see this dynamic really often. Now, on the other side of the scale, on the avoidance side, these are the people, like you described for your father, who are typically spent a lot of time in childhood alone. They were neglected, or maybe their parents were very stoic. Emotions weren't talked about. We're just going to sweep everything under the rug. Maybe they were heavily punished. Maybe they came from a high demand religion. There's all these scenarios, but the child learned very young that I don't trust my caregiver, that if I were to ask for help, that they will help me. And so they learned that I have me, myself, and I to depend on. And they grow up with a lens of I'm in the world myself.
Mhm.
I'm hyper independent. I'm overly self reliant. The way that I deal with things is I'm going to repress my own emotions. And so these people have a very hard time in relationships because, like we talked about earlier, they're so good at sort of dismissing and repressing their own emotions. They really don't know how to deal with someone else's emotions. It's
Yeah.
like they've got this pattern in their head, even if they are in a romantic relationship. Well, listen, if I'm having a bad day, I'll just deal with it with myself. And if you're having a bad day, you deal with it yourself. Like that's their pattern because that's how they grew up. No one was there to help them, right? Or they
Yeah.
didn't feel like they were. And so typically they have this deep seated fear around commitments because you're going to take away my freedom. You're going to disrupt my peace and my harmony. And, any interaction that I have with you might result in conflict, and they're petrified of conflict.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. What you just said, I have so much to say actually. One, I want to say this before I forget. The whole hate conflict, like scared of conflict. Like,
Mhm.
my dad lets people treat him like garbage. Like there's just some stuff that people do that he's just like, let's just not worry about it. Like he's like, I don't want to deal with this. Like, like he's always just like, and in my, I guess as a child, I was like thinking like, wow, he's so strong. He's just so good at dealing with problems. But in reality, he's scared of conflict. Like,
Mhm.
how bad like people treat my dad? Like my dad was actually in business and he did flooring and such for like 20 something years. And people would take advantage of him all the time. He'd be screwed out of money, like thousands and thousands of dollars. And then actually recently, because he had he worked in New Jersey with his business and he moved to Florida and he worked like a regular job. And this company, oh my God, treated him so bad. It took him like almost 2 years to actually quit. And me, my mom, my sister, like all of us, immediate, were kept telling him to leave because just the way they were treating him was just wrong. So they were like make him, so he's salary. So they would make him like get out of bed at like 1 in the morning because the fire alarm went off here and he's like an hour away. And he's like was the only like maintenance supervisor. But he was like a one person team. So if anything happened, like an alarm went off or this happened, it's like he always had to get out of bed and like go. And thing is, I'm sure he could say no, like to an extent. Like there's work life balance. If he's off, he's off. But no, he would jump over backwards and do
Yeah.
whatever they say. And then he's done so much with sacrificing, like his time. And at this point, the amount of time he worked, it's like I don't know how much he got paid, but it felt like it would be like minimum wage with the amount of hours he put in, the gas and all that. And so, what triggered him? So he did all this right for like 2 years. Is that they had like a new boss or whatever, like higher up, that came in and judged him off like meeting him like one time or something like that. And he had all these tasks on his list and no help. So naturally, it may not be physically possible to finish everything in like X amount of time, right? But this person didn't know my dad. didn't know everything in his past of what he's done for the company, and basically treated him like garbage and was like pretty much threatening to fire him at one point. And then he snapped because in his head he was like, "How dare you treat me like that?" And he just quit on the spot and just walked out. And he's never like my dad's been working since he was like 14 years old. He's like now 60. I think he's 60. 60 or 60. I think he's 60. Yeah. So he worked all of those years and he's never ever stood up for himself like that. Like this was like so like a huge like mind blowing for the whole family. I think he just after all these years he just snapped.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that there's a lot of parallels between how you describe your own behavior too, which really means that children are paying attention, right? We learn. So you talked about how people would yell at you and you
Mhm.
would freeze. In other words, you would stand there and just take it, right? And it kind of sounds like your father was probably doing the same thing. He was taking it and taking it and taking it until he hit that threshold, right?
Yeah.
Point of no return. And so we learn about these things. So the last category I wanted to mention, I mentioned that there's a smaller group, about 10% of the population here in North America, who fall into this disorganized attachment style, also known as a fearful avoidant. And these folks carry traits of both anxiously attached and avoidantly attached. Usually they oscillate back and forth depending on who they're interacting with, especially in a romantic relationship. So I spent most of my life as a fearful avoidant.
Mhm.
And so if I was interfacing with someone who was avoidant, I myself would get triggered into my anxious side. And if I was interfacing with someone who's anxious, I would become more avoidant. This is typical behavior for someone who's experienced abuse in their childhood. Very similar to what we talked about earlier on, a child, for example, who is seeking the care and comfort of, let's say, their father. Maybe they were riding their bike and they skinned their knee and they come in and they're crying, and the father says, stop crying, stop being a sissy, or I'll give you something to cry about, right? And like puts his hand up, like he's gonna. So the idea here is that the child really, really needs that love and comfort and support,
Mhm.
but the person who they're turning to for that love and support is also the same person who is harming them, right? So is hitting them, is yelling at them, is harming them in a multitude of different ways. And so this creates a very disorganized pattern in a child's mind where they can never feel safe. They're drawn towards this person as their caregiver, their person, for comfort and safety, as all humans are. But the closer they get, the more they risk being harmed as well. And so someone who has this sense of pattern will often be called, in a romantic sense, the hot and the cold partner. So one moment they're come, let's cuddle, and the next moment, I don't want to see you for 3 days.
It's me.
Okay. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, I wanna learn more about me.
Yeah, so fearful avoidance are very, very, they're interesting. By the way, there's a quiz on my website at securelyloved.com. It's a
Mhm,
free quiz. It'll take a couple of minutes. You can go and take it, answer a few questions. It'll give you your attachment style.
mhm. That's cool.
Yeah, but so again, growing up in this very chaotic environment, and what you'll see as an adult is that you'll likely, as a fearful avoidant, try to replicate that chaos in different ways. Like you probably actually really enjoy a sense of variety and change. People who are fearful avoidant tend to change jobs a lot. They tend to change partners a lot. They tend to change cities. They tend to be the people who be like, we're just going to rearrange the furniture. Like they need that constant change and that variety and that, yeah, because it sort of represents a little bit of chaos. And what the mind is doing here is that something that is too secure, that is too stable, it almost feels bland. It almost feels boring. Like, yeah. And so these are very, very common patterns that we see. So, another thing that would be very, very common with someone who's fearful avoidant when they're in a romantic relationship is the thing that they're going to value is they're going to value things like depth, right? The,
Mhm.
the, the depth of the connection, transparency,
Mhm.
honesty.
Mhm.
So the biggest core wound that the fearful avoidant carries around is I will be betrayed.
Yeah.
And you can see it's not a leap to understand how that core wound would develop. If I come close to you, my fear is that you're going to harm me in the way that my caregiver once did as well. So I'm going to come close and then I'm going to take two steps back, but I'm going to keep an arm's length distance to try to protect myself. And the way that I'm going to try to establish trust with you, because when you have a fearful avoidant attachment style, trusting people is extremely difficult, including yourself, by the way.
Do you know
Trusting
me?
yourself. Yeah. Have we met before?
You just know me so well. Oh my god. You're answering all the
But these
questions I
patterns
that
are
keeps me up at
predictive.
night.
Yeah, these patterns are highly predictive. And so what's so interesting is that because this is all learned behavior, it can be unlearned. And that is the work that I do with folks is
Yeah.
that we unlearn these patterns so that you can get into a healthier place. Because you know what? You do for your own self need to learn to trust yourself, to trust that you can handle whatever comes your way. I'm certain that folks who are fearful avoidant also have the highest degree of core wounds. Right, because
Oh, I
because
want to say like, gee, thanks.
right. And
Apparently, I laugh. My therapist says I laugh when I'm emotionally disconnected.
yes, it's a buffer. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. But that's okay. That's okay. I would venture a guess too, without getting too personal, that you have a whole series of behaviors that you go to and turn to deal with when you're stressed. So this whole cohort of people who are insecurely attached and they really struggle with emotional volatility, they heavily rely on coping behaviors or numbing behaviors to be able to handle a lot of the times what feels like a very heightened emotional state. So, this particular cohort of people is very, very ripe for all sorts of addictions, any addiction, drugs, alcohol, shopping addiction, gambling addiction, porn addiction, sex and love addiction. I
All the
can go
great
on and on.
stuff. I'm kidding.
Yeah. I mean, so it's like we tend to think that, addictions are an issue unto themselves, but the way I understand and deal with addictions is addictions are there generally because people are using them to numb the pain and the feelings that they don't want to deal with. And so when you learn how to deal with these feelings, like I noticed in myself that all of these coping mechanisms that I had, I no longer utilize. Like
Yeah.
I don't drink anymore. There's a whole bunch of things that I used to do to just sort of get through the day. I
Mhm.
don't need that anymore. And so the process of healing is such a beautiful thing.
That sounds really beautiful. And when you were saying like all these addictions and such, like if I didn't have the kind of self awareness and the route that I went down when it came to human behavior, I'd probably be a mess by now because like I'm not an alcoholic. I don't like drink like that. But at one point when I was under all that stress during that time frame I was telling you about, I was drinking a lot, like every single night. I wasn't drinking like passing out kind of drinking. It was like pretty much just wine. But like I was going through so much emotionally. And then also, I just add a pandemic in there too while you're at it. And I'm here drinking a bottle a night. So, yeah, I was doing that at one point and didn't realize that it was such a problem after like I gained like a million pounds. I was like, oh my God, how could I be drinking so much wine? But I know that's, yeah. So, anyway, so after that, me subconsciously doing that, I was thinking, like, oh, I love wine, which I do love wine. And it always goes from like one glass of wine to like the whole bottle.
Mhm.
But now I like stop myself. Like I don't like I try my best to not drink like alone, just like watching TV, which I know a lot of people just have like one glass. But I know myself now, and I'm like, I have one glass, I'm having like half a bottle, and yeah, which is it's not good. And also, I also stay away from hard liquor because if I have too much to drink, every coping mechanism that I have, every filter that I have just goes out the window. Apparently, at my sister's wedding, I threw a tray at my mom because it was like at the end of the night, too. I was like completely gone. I think I blacked out that night. And I threw a tray, but the reason is because I guess I was being like super annoying drunk, and then she grabbed onto me, and that's where it happens. Because she was being controlling, because she's was like that as a mother, like very controlling of my life, and I'm the kind of person where I want to be free. And so she basically put me in a box my whole life. And so when she, obviously she doesn't do that anymore. I'm an adult, I'm free and such. That moment, I was like 22 then. And when she grabbed on my wrist, that's when I snapped at her.
Yeah. So there's that forced, it's not affection, but the forced touching that is really a trigger point for you. So it's good to know that. And you can see that it's repeating, right? That you have the, like, when you're being forced to do something you're uncomfortable with, obviously it triggers you. And so forced touch for you is really a trigger point. But you seem to understand yourself really well.
It's a lot of years. I
Yeah.
went through a lot of therapy, a lot of just learning. And also, I learned, honestly, this podcast, I learned so much from other people. It's like my own therapy in a way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've had multiple therapists over the years, and just done a lot of different things throughout like my whole life. And also, human behavior is just like so interesting to me. I read books too. Like the last book I read was What Happened to You. Have you heard of that one? That's a good one.
Maybe. I mean, I've read so many
It
books.
wasn't too old because when I was reading it, they brought up the pandemic. So yeah, it's not that old, I guess. But then how about The Body Keeps Score?
That's yeah. Bessel van der Kolk, he's one of my favorites. Dr. Gabor Mate is one of my favorites.
Hmm.
His newest book is The Myth of Normal.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's very, very good. Very, very good.
Yeah, I just finished the What Happened to You one. It's really good. Highly recommended. It's by Oprah Winfrey and Drew Perry. They co-wrote it together.
Okay.
So good. Like
Okay.
I read that thing. So I've never read a book that fast, and I'm so sad it's done. I'm so sad it's over. But it talked a lot about kind of like I don't think they talk about attachment, but it was a lot about like certain things with trauma, and like instead of saying like what's wrong with me, it's like what happened to me. Like
Mhm.
that was the main thing. But I know I said that twice. Let's go into everything that you do. So you are a certified attachment practitioner.
I am.
Yeah, can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, thank you. So, my company is securelylove.com. We are a collective of relationship and attachment trauma practitioners. So, we work just in this space, helping people to understand what they experienced in childhood and how that's playing out in today's world in terms of their emotional patterns, in terms of their coping mechanism, their thought patterns, and all that stuff. And so, yeah, we offer a 20-minute free consult if people are interested in meeting with us. And there's also the free quiz that we talked about. So people could go on my website and they can take the quiz if they're interested in knowing what is my attachment style. I also have an online course on Udemy that does pretty well. It's the top attachment styles course on Udemy. So kind of proud that we are getting the word out
Hmm.
about attachment styles and how important this is for us. And yeah, this is
Yeah. It's
yeah,
a
it's important work.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity for people to understand themselves, and like we're so complex. And what you were saying before is a lot of people think that we all have the same life. Because some people be like, why is this person acting like this? I don't understand this. And then so many people just don't. There's a lot of people, the big population we have here. Like the majority of people don't realize that we all come from different walks of life. And I feel like if there's more education about that, at least that I'm talking more on the side of the society versus like within. But I feel like if more people did the work, like what, like how you help people, how amazing would society be in the next generations?
So I've always said this. I've always said that this should be taught, in the earliest of years in school. This is just
Yes.
basic human behavior. And I think if, especially the point around emotional regulation, I think if people understood a little bit more about emotional regulation, how to connect to their own emotions and how to deal in a healthy way with emotions that are uncomfortable. So I'm lonely, I'm sad, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. How do I deal with those emotions without harming myself and harming others? And we don't teach people this stuff, but we live in a society, where, in my opinion, if people learn the skills, and it is a skill, learn the
Yeah.
skill how to emotionally regulate, we would, it would be like crime prevention. It'd be like
Yes.
abuse prevention. It would be violence prevention. It would
Less
be,
shooting up schools.
well, that's it.
Hopefully no shooting up schools, period.
I mean, so all of this is really coming out of a state of people who are completely emotionally imbalanced. And I'm not talking about mental illness. I'm not talking about personality disorders, but people who just have not even learned how to emotionally regulate. And so I think our world would be far more harmonious, peaceful. And so this is why I do the work that I do is, yes, you had a difficult childhood. Many of us did, but now we're adults and now we can choose to learn a different way because I promise you the techniques and the coping mechanisms that you've been using to date are not working for you or they won't work in the long term. So if you really want to move to a place where you yourself feel calmer and more at ease and the relationships around you become smoother and more harmonious, there really is only one way to do that. And that's to put a mirror to your own face and go, okay, why am I doing the things that I do? And
Yeah.
can I change it? And yeah, you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on here. I really do appreciate you.
Thank you.
And for everyone who's listening, hope you guys have a good rest of your day or evening and stay tuned for next week's episode.